The art of self-mastery amidst the clamor of others. In the midst of our daily interactions, we often find ourselves at the mercy of emotional winds. The actions and words of others toss us about, awakening the monster of anger within, or leaving us prey to a silent annoyance that drains our energy. Stoic philosophers, from the ancient colonnades of Athens to the palaces of Rome, realize that our true suffering does not stem from the actions of people directed at us, but rather from our judgments and interpretations of those actions. Stoicism is not a call to numb or suppress emotions, as is often rumored. Rather, it is an impenetrable fortress we build with awareness. It helps us realize that the external world and human behavior are entirely beyond our control, while our true and only kingdom is our mind. Hence begins our journey toward liberation from the grip of anger and distress, not by attempting to change the people around us, but by dismantling our internal responses to them. First, recognizing the thought loop. The safe distance between mind and pain. The first steps of this liberation begin from within, specifically at that critical moment when the spark of irritation ignites. When we face a provoking situation or are suddenly ambushed by a memory of someone who wronged us, the mind automatically tends to spiral into an endless vortex of ruminative thinking and scenario generation. Here, the renewed Stoic approach teaches us a golden rule. Do not fight your disturbing thoughts violently. A fierce resistance to a memory or an attempt to forcefully banish it does nothing but feed it and grant it a magnitude greater than its reality. Instead, when that thought rears its head and you sense the onset of anger, take a mental step back, observe it coldly, and then calmly tell yourself, "Here we go. This is the usual loop." This simple phrase is not merely a passing string of words. It is a highly significant psychological and philosophical tool, inherently rooted in what is known as mindful observation. The moment you put a name to what is happening, shifting from someone engaged in anger to an observer of it, you create a safe distance between yourself and the pain. This detachment strips the thought of its dictatorial authority over your consciousness, transforming it from an absolute painful reality into a mere passing mental event that you can watch drift by without handing over the reins of your control. Taming the physiological storm. However, for this philosophical awareness to be complete, we must not fall into the trap of intellectual idealism and ignore our biological nature. Anger and distress are not just abstract thoughts swimming in the mind. They are a physiological storm that strikes the body fiercely. When the disturbing thought loop begins to spin, the brain releases massive doses of adrenaline, the heartbeat accelerates, and the chest tightens in response to latent anxiety or anger. Mindful observation of thoughts alone may not be enough to extinguish these physical fires if not accompanied by a tangible intervention to calm the nervous system. The Stoic sage does not ignore their body, but rather restores it to a state of equilibrium in service of their mind. Therefore, the moment you realize the onset of irritation, do not merely observe the thought. Direct your attention immediately to your physical responses. Anchor yourself. Use deep and slow breathing techniques as an anchor to ground you in the present moment. Signal safety. This breathing acts as a chemical signal telling your nervous system that the danger has passed. Reclaim control. This process pulls the rug out from under the physical surge of anger, granting your tranquil mind ample space to apply its Stoic principles wisely, free from the interference of stress hormones. Second, ceasing to monitor the other, reclaiming the keys to inner peace. After we succeed in taming the disturbing thought and calming the body's physical storm, Stoic wisdom leads us to the next arena of confrontation, the external world. Specifically, it addresses that voluntary trap we set for ourselves when we monitor those who have caused our distress. Tracking the other party's news or closely following the details of their lives, whether through mutual social circles or the keyholes of digital surveillance on social media platforms, is nothing but an intentional act of keeping the wound bleeding. Every time you snoop on their daily lives, you voluntarily surrender your sovereignty and hand them the keys to your inner peace. By doing so, you hold your own psychological stability hostage to their movements, their successes, or even their fleeting smiles. Stoicism teaches us that this behavior is a direct violation of the most fundamental rule of wisdom. Focus only on what is within your control. the lives and actions of others lie entirely outside our circle of control. The decision to stop monitoring them is, in essence, a declaration of personal responsibility. It is an acknowledgement that our healing does not depend on what happens to them, but solely on what we choose for ourselves. The dilemma of shared environments. When blocking is impossible, but what if this other is an integral part of your daily reality? What if your work environment, family circle, or mutual friends impose their presence upon you, stripping you of the luxury of physical avoidance or a complete digital block? Here, Stoicism does not ask you to flee or isolate yourself. Rather, it invites you to forge a much more resilient philosophical shield. If you cannot banish them from your physical environment, you must banish them from your psychological one. In shared spaces that force you to cross paths, train your mind to adopt what we might call emotional neutrality. Treat their presence in the room exactly as you would treat a piece of furniture or the falling rain, a mere natural occurrence in your environment that warrants neither agitation nor anger. To achieve this, follow these guiding principles. Establish invisible boundaries. Draw strict, unseen lines. Be professional, polite strictly within the limits of necessity, and consistently brief. Avoid noticeable fear. Do not go out of your way to avoid them in a manner that reveals apprehension or discomfort. Preserve your energy. Do not drain your vitality trying to prove a point or send a message to them. Let their physical presence pass through your senses without leaving a single scratch on the walls of your soul. True peace, as envisioned by the Stoic sage, does not lie in retreating to an isolated island free of bothersome people. Rather, it is found in the profound ability to stand right in the heart of the crowd, side by side with them, maintaining your inner stillness like a mountain unshaken by the wind. Third, separating reality from interpretation. Dismantling the illusory narrative. After securely sealing the gateways of external surveillance and reclaiming our captured attention from the lives of others, we now turn inward, toward the silent courtroom our minds convene around the clock. Here we arrive at one of the deepest pillars of Stoic philosophy, embodied in the immortal words of the philosopher Epictetus. People are not disturbed by things, but by the views they take of them. Every time we experience abandonment, neglect, or a harsh word, the human mind, instinctively programmed to expect the worst as a defense mechanism, performs a dangerous merging process. It conflates the objective event with our subjective interpretation of it. If someone walks out of your life or acts rudely, the exclusive reality here is they left, or they uttered specific words. Period. End of sentence. But the mind is not satisfied with this. It rushes to weave a destructive, dramatic narrative, whispering its own interpretations. They left because I am not enough. Or, they acted this way because I do not deserve respect. This latter interpretation is not a fact. It is a limiting belief and an unjust sentence you have passed upon yourself. It is the true fuel that feeds the fires of anger and distress. The crucial Stoic step here is to bring forth the scissors of awareness and sever the illusory thread that connects the actions of others to your self-worth. The wisdom of emotion. When logic needs the balm of compassion. However, we must pause here for a moment. Dismantling these limiting beliefs might seem, at first glance, like a cold and rigid mental exercise. A literal, dry application of logic might cause us to flagellate ourselves whenever we feel sad, thinking we have failed to be true Stoics. This is where the desperate need arises for something indispensable in the healing journey: self-compassion. The Stoic sage is not an emotionless calculator. They are a human being who understands their own nature. When your mind's negative interpretations attack you and make you feel inadequate, do not confront them solely with the harsh whips of logic. Instead, bathe yourself first in a dose of emotional acceptance and solace. Acknowledge the pain. Allow yourself to feel the natural sting of pain resulting from the situation. Validate your humanity. Tell yourself tenderly, "It is normal to feel sad right now. This is an expected human reaction, and it is entirely okay." This emotional embrace of our human vulnerability melts away internal resistance, preparing the soul's soil to subsequently receive the seeds of Stoic logic. When you comfort yourself first, it becomes much easier to calmly tell your mind, "We have suffered, yes, But we will not compound the pain by burdening ourselves with a guilt we did not commit or a flaw we do not possess. Thus, philosophical logic harmonizes with human gentleness, forging together an impenetrable shield. Fourth, the illusion of closure, forging your own ending. In the continuation of our journey to restore the self and build fortresses of inner peace, and having succeeded in stripping reality of our distorted interpretations, we find ourselves facing the gap of the open ending, that void suddenly left by absence. The human soul, by virtue of its innate attachment to stories and their completion, tends to wait for a final scene to gather the scattered pieces of the tale. We wait for an apology to restore our dignity, a logical justification to explain the reasons for departure, or even a final conversation to cross the T's and dot the I's. This urgent longing for what is known as closure, or the perfect ending, is, in essence, nothing but a mirage keeping us captive in the desert of the past. It is an illusion telling us that our healing is postponed until the other party decides to utter the final word. The Stoic reality of silence. Here, Stoic wisdom intervenes to demolish this illusion from its roots, reminding us of one of its most important pillars, the strict distinction between what is within our control and what is beyond our will. Waiting for an ending from someone else is tantamount to a voluntary surrender of the keys to your inner fortress. When you tie your psychological peace to an acknowledgement or apology that must be provided by the one who left, you declare your submission to total emotional slavery. You make your healing contingent upon the other's conscience, their mood, and their capacity for confrontation, all elements over which you have absolutely no authority. The true Stoic realizes that life does not owe us neatly arranged theatrical endings, that silence is often a complete answer in itself, and that the departure itself is the ending that requires no further explanation. The noble release of emotion. However, adopting this strict philosophical stance does not mean a cold detachment from our humanity, nor does it mean turning the heart into deaf stone. Herein lies the profound subtlety that we must not overlook in the healing process. Letting go of waiting for the other does not equate to suppressing the storm raging in the depths. The words left unsaid, the questions hanging in the throat, and the grief that has not been given its space. These are all real emotional energies that demand release. Bottling up these feelings under the guise of Stoic toughness is a betrayal of the self and a postponement of pain, not a cure for it. Wisdom does not mean denying the wound. It means choosing the noble way to deal with it, a way that preserves our dignity and begs nothing from the outside. The therapeutic power of the unsent letter. From this perspective emerges the desperate need to invent our own closure, independent of the other parties in the relationship. When emotions crowd in and nearly suffocate the soul, a blank sheet of paper becomes the safe haven and the stage upon which our naked truth is revealed. Sitting down to write a lengthy letter to the other party, a letter into which every drop of anger, disappointment, longing, and reproach is poured, without the slightest intention of sending it, is a profoundly powerful therapeutic practice and emotional release. On that paper, you are not seeking their answers. Rather, you are granting your muffled voice the right to scream. You write to confess your human vulnerability to yourself. You write to purge the toxins of betrayal from your body. This solitary act is a true embodiment of self-mastery. You give your feelings the right to exist and be expressed, while simultaneously adhering to the principle of not begging for a response. When you tear up that paper after finishing it, or burn it so its ashes scatter, you are performing the final ritual of liberation. You are telling your subconscious that the story has ended by your own decision and that you no longer need their words to realize your worth or to continue on your path. Thus, the Stoic acceptance of the absence of external closure intertwines beautifully with human tenderness in embracing and releasing pain, allowing you to forge, by yourself and for yourself, an independent, free peace that waits for no one's permission. Fifth, the trap of selective memory. Dismantling the romanticization of pain. After firmly shutting the doors of the past with our sovereign decisions and ceasing to beg for comforting endings from others, we find ourselves face to face with a far more cunning trap. It resides in the hollows of our minds and feeds on our loneliness, selective memory. In the aftermath of loss and driven by an instinctive urge to mitigate the shock of emptiness, the human mind tends to practice an emotional deception known as the romanticization of pain. The mind begins to extract warm scenes, luminous moments, and tender words, constructing from them a perfect cinematic film that plays endlessly on the screen of our consciousness. In contrast, it systematically erases all scenes of betrayal, neglect, constant tension, and the fundamental flaws that were gnawing at the very nerve of that relationship. This false beautification of the past places us in a state of voluntary enslavement to a phantom that no longer exists. It makes us weep over a statue of illusion, sculpted by our wishes, rather than the real person we experienced in reality. Radical realism, the antidote to nostalgia. Here, Stoic rigor manifests as a magnifying glass that exposes the falsehood of this nostalgia. Stoic philosophy invites us to practice what might be called radical realism, forcing ourselves to summon the complete, unretouched picture. We must consciously remember the nights of anxiety, the coldness of emotions, the gradual fading, and those moments when we felt like strangers in the presence of the one we loved. This intentional recall of the relationship's dark side is not a call to hatred or malice. Rather, it is a cognitive antidote that dismantles the myth of the lost ideal. Seeing the experience in its naked truth, with all its distortions and shortcomings, severs the umbilical cord that feeds pathological attachment. It returns us to solid ground where it is easier to deal with facts instead of legends. The danger of emotional repression and legitimate grief. However, if this strict logical analysis is applied arbitrarily, it may lead us down a dangerous slope often overlooked by advocates of mental toughness, the suppression of legitimate grief. In our frantic rush to dismantle the illusions of memory and apply Stoic rationality, we might mistakenly conflate the romanticization of pain with natural mourning. Authentic Stoicism at its core never demanded that a human being turn into an unfeeling deaf rock, nor did it ever consider tears a flaw that contradicts wisdom. When a deep human bond is severed, and when the contours of our daily lives change due to the absence of someone who occupied a vast space within it, feeling sad is not a cognitive malfunction. It is a living testament to our humanity and our capacity to love and connect. Leaping directly toward cold analysis and attempting to cancel out pain under the pretext of not romanticizing it is, in reality, a dangerous process of repression. It will turn this grief into accumulated toxins in the depths of the soul. Grief is a necessary physiological and psychological process, much like a body's fever fighting off an infection. It is the way the psychological system resets itself to adapt to the new reality. Therefore, the wise balance lies in allowing ourselves to grieve, but consciously. We cry, yes, but we do not cry for the imaginary soulmate portrayed by our selective memory. Instead, we cry for the profound sense of loss itself, the effort expended that bore no fruit, the time invested, a part of ourselves that we left behind in that phase of our lives. The complete picture, a bridge to healing. Thus, the picture is complete. We use the Stoic mind to strip the past of its false romantic illusions, preventing ourselves from slipping into the swamp of beautifying our wounds. At the exact same moment, we open our arms in a warm, gentle embrace of our simple human grief. We let it pass through us like a natural winter storm, experiencing it with all our senses without handing it the keys to permanent residence. We realize that this honest, fully felt pain is the inevitable bridge that will carry us toward the shore of true healing and a peace firmly rooted in reality. Distance as medicine, the practical phase of recovery. After crossing the bridge of conscious grief and purging our memories of the impurities of false romance, we arrive, on our path toward emotional liberation, at the practical phase of recovery. This is the stage where thought transforms into behavior, and wisdom manifests in decisive spatial and temporal decisions. Here, the principle of distance as medicine emerges as one of the most important pillars for restoring balance. In the midst of the emotional storms that follow loss, wounded pride often whispers to us to make our absence a sword with which to punish those who let us down, or to use silence as a shield for revenge, attempting to prove our importance in their lives. But Stoic philosophy, through the voices of its sages like Epictetus, rises above this childish absurdity and refuses to turn relationships into arenas for settling scores. In mature philosophical tradition, distance is not a weapon of war we raise in the face of the other. Rather, it is a necessary surgical room to excise pathological attachment from our souls. It is a conscious, tactical withdrawal and the establishment of sacred boundaries that give the soul a chance to catch its breath, far from the triggers that poke and reopen wounds every time. When we decide to walk away, we effectively lift our hands from attempting to control the other, directing our entire energy toward what we truly control, ourselves. Thus, we succeed in transforming isolation from a harsh punishment imposed by the circumstances of the ending into a sovereign healing tool. We choose it of our own free will to rebuild our collapsed internal fortresses, giving our psychological system a space of calm to process the trauma without interference. The dark trap, when distance turns into fatal loneliness. However, settling for this idealistic theorization of the benefits of isolation and distancing carries a dark trap often overlooked by superficial readings of mental toughness. Absolute distance, if not managed with wisdom and care, can quickly flip from a healing remedy into a deadly poison in the form of fatal loneliness. The massive void left by the absence of someone who filled vast spaces of our days and thoughts cannot be bridged merely by abstract philosophical meditation or retreating within the walls of the self. The human being is instinctively a social creature, and Stoicism, at its core, never calls for monasticism or detachment from the human fabric. Rather, it calls for harmony with human nature. Utter seclusion and the attempt to apply distance radically can turn the fortress of recovery into a desolate cell where the echoes of memories reverberate even more lethally. This makes the individual easy prey to depression and deep introversion. Distributing emotional weight, the balanced social strategy. Therefore, true wisdom and a comprehensive methodology manifest in balancing this distance with effective alternative social strategies. It is not enough to move away from the source of pain. We must simultaneously move closer to the sources of life. This requires a conscious effort to fill this new void. Rekindle old bonds. Revive family ties and old friendships that may have eroded or been marginalized during your excessive preoccupation with the past relationship. Open new circles. Expand into new social circles and engage in communities that share your interests and passions. Immerse in shared life. Being in supportive environments, engaging in conversations that do not revolve around loss and pain, and participating in group activities are vital actions that reprogram the subconscious mind. These actions cement the truth that sources of happiness, support, and belonging are not the monopoly of one single person, and that life is far too vast to be reduced to a story that has ended. Through this social effort, we are not replacing one person with another in an attempt to escape confrontation. Instead, we are redistributing our emotional weight, which used to rest entirely on a single pillar, across multiple sturdy pillars. This way, if one is absent, the soul remains resilient, drawing its balance and strength from a broad, healthy network of human connections. Only in this way is the efficacy of distance as medicine truly complete. A distancing that protects from harm, matched perfectly by an approaching that nourishes the soul and prevents it from drying out in the desert of loneliness. Sixth, reclaiming time. Between the call of the future and the necessity of stillness, after establishing our safe distances to contain the pain and working to restore our fortresses with an awareness that neither denies grief nor drowns in desolate isolation, we find ourselves facing the most precious resource depleted by emotional suffering: time. In the throes of attachment and constant rumination about those who have departed, we were actively spending from the balance of our lives, burning our hours in engines of anxiety that produce nothing but illusion. Here, Stoicism manifests in its finest practical form, embodied in the immortal call of the philosopher Seneca regarding the shortness of life. He warns us that the greatest waste we commit is not squandering money, but squandering time on a past that is no longer in our possession. The next step on the path to liberation is reclaiming time, a sovereign recovery of those mental and temporal spaces that were occupied by the ghost of the other. This principle invites us to radically shift the helm of our energy away from the sterile swamp of the past, steering it instead toward the promising horizon of the future. The hours that were dissipated in anticipation, analysis, and the regurgitation of memories must now be invested in refining the self, broadening horizons, and building a solid personal edifice. This investment is the true essence of self-development. To build your knowledge, establish your projects, and strengthen your physical and intellectual structure to become a more resilient and wiser version of yourself. The tyranny of frantic productivity, the modern trap. However, amidst this enthusiastic proposition of self-recovery, a modern and common trap hides under the cloak of development, what can be termed the tyranny of frantic productivity. Many superficial interpretations of mental toughness push a person, immediately after experiencing loss, to leap directly into the arena of work and achievement. They demand that one turn their pain into instant fuel for success, filling every second of their time with learning a new skill, reading a complex book, or engaging in grueling labor to forget the pain. This immense pressure to be productive immediately upon breaking ignores a profound biological and psychological truth. Healing requires time to ferment. The human mind is not a deaf machine that can be reprogrammed with the push of a button, nor a digital system that responds to new commands the moment old data is erased. When the psychological system suffers the trauma of loss, it goes through a state of profound depletion and exhaustion. Forcing it at this stage into intense productivity and continuous learning is exactly like trying to run a precise and complex system while it is weighed down by accumulated errors. The inevitable result is a breakdown. The absolute necessity of negative rest. Here emerges the absolute necessity for what is known as negative rest. A balanced Stoic philosophy understands the rhythm of nature and does not clash with it. Just as muscle fibers do not grow and gain strength during stress and strenuous exercise, but rather require periods of total stillness and deep rest to recover from micro-tears and rebuild their mass, so too does the human soul. Before we demand of ourselves a mighty rise in creative production, we must administer a dose of stillness. Negative rest is not laziness or a surrender to weakness. Rather, it is an active act of recovery at its core, despite its outward stillness. It involves permission to pause, allowing the self to do nothing for a period of time without feeling guilty. Embracing quietude, sitting in silence, observing the succession of days, and getting adequate sleep. Releasing pressure, temporarily letting go of strict achievement schedules. It is the space of truce the mind needs to process heavy emotional data and rearrange its scattered papers before resuming construction. Wisdom in the pace of healing. When we acknowledge the time that the natural healing process takes and respect the need of our bodies and minds for a period of convalescence, we apply the highest degrees of wisdom. We realize that reclaiming time does not necessarily mean immediately filling it with noise and work. Rather, in its initial phase, it means reclaiming our right to tranquility and inner peace. After the soul fulfills its right to stillness and the deep tears heal, you will find that the energy for production and development flows from within you spontaneously, pure and strong, ready to build a future worthy of the magnitude of your patience and wisdom. Taming the wandering mind. Between mental vigilance and the refuge of deliberate distraction. Having claimed our right to negative rest and allowed our wounds to heal in stillness without flogging ourselves with the whips of frantic productivity, we now move to confront the real and most enduring battlefield, the mind. For even after we make the decision to physically distance ourselves and direct our energies toward the future, the human mind retains an innate and stubborn tendency to wander back to its old familiarities. In moments of silence before sleep, or even in the middle of a busy day, you may find your mind stealthily slipping past the walls of the present to return and roam the alleys of the past, conjuring a face, a voice, or a fleeting moment. Here, the Stoic approach introduces a fundamental technique known as attention, or prosauche, the rigorous, repetitive practice of mindfulness. This training requires you to play the role of the vigilant guard at the gates of your thoughts. Every time you catch your mind red-handed, escaping toward the fantasies of the past, or ruminating on memories of an ended relationship, you must issue a firm mental command to bring it back to the present moment. It is a process akin to taming a wild horse. You do not beat it harshly, but rather pull the reins gently and firmly every time it veers off the path. You tell yourself with pure awareness, I have drifted again. This is the usual loop of thinking, and then you pull your focus back to what is happening now. Over time, this mental practice builds an insulating distance between you and the thought, stripping the memory of its compulsive emotional charge. The trap of abstract awareness. When the present is empty. However, despite the immense philosophical power of the principle of returning to the present, relying exclusively on it overlooks a highly significant psychological loophole. The human mind abhors a vacuum, and fighting a thought merely by issuing commands to cancel it often leads to what is known as the ironic rebound effect. The more you order your mind to stop thinking about a white bear, the more present it becomes in your imagination. Trying to drag the mind away from an emotionally crowded past to force it into a reality characterized by boredom or emptiness is a brutal war of attrition, often ending in the exhaustion of willpower. You cannot simply command your mind to be aware if there is nothing tangible and stimulating for it to be aware of. Herein lies the fundamental flaw in the proposition that relies solely on returning to the present as its only tool. It treats the mind like a detached machine, ignoring the desperate need to invent a present worthy of attention. Deliberate distraction, active immersion as an anchor for the soul. To overcome this depletion, we must integrate mental observation with a highly effective strategy: deliberate distraction. The word distraction might initially seem contradictory to Stoic presence, but we are not speaking here of cowardly escapism or passive numbing with trivial amusements. Rather, we are talking about active immersion. It is the process of intentionally and intensely directing the energy of attention toward an activity that demands complete mental or physical presence, leaving no room within the space of consciousness for the reservoirs of the past. The intellectual flow. Imagine that moment when you are fully immersed in writing consecutive lines of logic and building a complex software architecture on your screen. Every detail requires sharp focus to solve a problem or connect one algorithm to another, creating a new digital reality from nothing. The physical anchor. Or imagine that rigorous physical engagement when lifting heavy weights, with utter focus on the contraction of your muscle fibers. Sweat pours and breathing accelerates under the weight of meticulously calculated physical exertion, making bodybuilding a literal unburdening of the soul's weight. It becomes an anchor that forces the mind to exist within the confines of the body in the exact current second. The creative escape. Or even when you dive into drafting an article or weaving a story, where words flow to craft alternative worlds. In these states of immersion, psychologically known as the state of flow, you are not practicing the return to the present as an exhausting defensive act, but rather as a creative offensive one. You do not resist the memory directly. Instead, you pull the rug out from under it by presenting your mind with an enjoyable and complex challenge. Activities that require deep focus, passion, and sensory engagement act as natural painkillers and effective tools for a neurological factory reset. Creating density in the present. The complete wisdom here is marrying the philosopher's awareness with the doer's vitality. When memories of the past attack you fiercely and you find that your attempts to observe the thought drain your energy, there is no shame in changing tactics. Turn the page immediately and plunge into your favorite hobby, open your pending project, start a grueling workout, or engage in a creative endeavor that demands your full attention. With this approach, you are not escaping yourself, you are building it. Deliberate distraction in things of value creates a kind of density in the present, a density capable of competing with and overcoming the gravitational pull of the past. Over time, with the continuous repetition of this immersion, you will not find yourself having to drag your mind forcefully toward the present. Instead, you will find that your mind has fallen in love with this present, full of passion and achievement, and has chosen of its own free will to settle within it, leaving the past behind like ruins that evoke nothing more than a wise, tranquil smile. Profound self-mastery, liberating identity from the grip of absence and the ghosts of childhood. When the dust of daily battles with memory settles, and after we succeed in taming our wandering minds through active immersion in life's paths, we reach the deepest and most fragile layer of the soul, identity. The greatest challenge following the loss of a pivotal person in our lives is not merely dealing with the emotional or temporal void, but protecting the fundamental building block by which we define ourselves. In moments of brokenness, the human mind, exhausted by the intensity of pain, tends to commit a fatal strategic error. It transforms a fleeting event into a permanent identity, making absence a black sun around which all the details of the self revolve. The cognitive sin, I am not the event. A person's descent into defining themselves as the one who was rejected, or the victim who was left behind, is what Stoic philosophy calls the ultimate cognitive sin. Stoicism draws a strict dividing line between the action that befalls us and the essence that represents us. Rejection, departure, or the end of a relationship are all external events that revolve in the orbit of fate and the choices of others. They do not in any way touch your intrinsic value. When you allow this absence to seep into the core of your identity, you are practically committing moral suicide. You strip yourself of all your achievements, your thoughts, and your principles, reducing your vast, expansive being into a mere blind spot left by someone else. The true Stoic stands here as a vigilant guard at the gate of identity, vehemently rejecting this flawed reduction. They realize they are an independent human being, fully capable and dignified, who has gone through a painful experience of loss, but is absolutely not the embodiment of loss. This mental independence is the first shield that protects the psychological structure from total collapse. The hidden roots of pain when awareness is not enough. However, despite the profound astuteness of the classical Stoic proposition that calls for changing thoughts to protect identity, it sometimes collides with a solid psychological wall, a wall revealing a deep gap ignored by superficial analyses of emotional resilience. Often, we try hard to apply these rational rules. We repeat the principles and attempt to separate ourselves from the experience, only to find ourselves pulled by an overwhelming force toward the bottom of pathological attachment. Why? Because the problem at its roots is not merely a wrong thought that can be corrected with logic. Here we must open the locked door to the deep psychological dimension, past traumas and childhood wounds. For a soul whose makeup carries immense empathy and an extreme sensitivity to the pain of others, perhaps occasionally finding itself viewing life as an arena burdened with successive worries and sorrows, the incident of rejection or departure is not read by the subconscious as a passing event. Rather, it explodes like a bomb, awakening the deepest fears and confirming the worst suspicions about the cruelty of the world. In these profound cases, excessive attachment to the other party and the identity collapse that follows their departure are merely symptoms of a much older disease. This attachment might be a desperate attempt by the inner child to compensate for an old emotional deprivation, or to prove worthiness of love after experiencing marginalization or neglect in their formative years. When this person leaves, you do not cry only for their loss. The primal wound of rejection is reopened, and all the feelings of helplessness and powerlessness that accompanied your childhood rush back to you. Stoic courage in facing the shadow. Dealing with this level of pain requires going far beyond mere philosophical repetition or superficial mindset shifts. Leaping over these deep wounds under the pretext of rational transcendence is a form of luxurious escapism. True wisdom lies in acknowledging the limits of self-practice and realizing that an identity damaged by childhood traumas requires specialized restoration. Here, resorting to depth psychology and dismantling attachment styles is not a contradiction of Stoic philosophy, but rather its supreme application. Stoicism teaches us to use the right tools to deal with reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. If the reality is the presence of a trauma rooted in the unconscious that makes a person's absence feel like the end of the world, then Stoic courage manifests in sitting in the therapist's chair, confronting those old ghosts and untangling the knots that have shackled your soul for years. Thus, we rebuild our identity on true, unshakable foundations. We do not merely refuse to reduce ourselves to a story of absence. We dive into our depths to heal the roots that made us susceptible to this reduction in the first place. We save our identity from immediate calling. Profound self-mastery, liberating identity from the grip of absence and the ghosts of childhood. When the dust of daily battles with memory settles, and after we succeed in taming our wandering minds through active immersion in life's paths, we reach the deepest and most fragile layer of the soul, identity. The greatest challenge following the loss of a pivotal person in our lives is not merely dealing with the emotional or temporal void, but protecting the fundamental building block by which we define ourselves. In moments of brokenness, the human mind, exhausted by the intensity of pain, tends to commit a fatal strategic error. It transforms a fleeting event into a permanent identity, making absence a black sun around which all the details of the self revolve. The cognitive sin, I am not the event. A person's descent into defining themselves as the one who was rejected or the victim who was left behind is what Stoic philosophy calls the ultimate cognitive sin. Stoicism draws a strict dividing line between the action that befalls us and the essence that represents us. Rejection, departure, or the end of a relationship are all external events that revolve in the orbit of fate and the choices of others. They do not in any way touch your intrinsic value. When you allow this absence to seep into the core of your identity, you are practically committing moral suicide. You strip yourself of all your achievements, your thoughts, and your principles, reducing your vast, expansive being into a mere blind spot left by someone else. The true Stoic stands here as a vigilant guard at the gate of identity, vehemently rejecting this flawed reduction. They realize they are an independent human being, fully capable and dignified, who has gone through a painful experience of loss, but is absolutely not the embodiment of loss. This mental independence is the first shield that protects the psychological structure from total collapse. The hidden roots of pain when awareness is not enough. However, despite the profound astuteness of the classical Stoic proposition that calls for changing thoughts to protect identity, it sometimes collides with a solid psychological wall, a wall revealing a deep gap ignored by superficial analyses of emotional resilience. Often, we try hard to apply these rational rules. We repeat the principles and attempt to separate ourselves from the experience, only to find ourselves pulled by an overwhelming force toward the bottom of pathological attachment. Why? Because the problem at its roots is not merely a wrong thought that can be corrected with logic. Here we must open the locked door to the deep psychological dimension, past traumas and childhood wounds. For a soul whose makeup carries immense empathy and an extreme sensitivity to the pain of others, perhaps occasionally finding itself viewing life as an arena burdened with successive worries and sorrows, the incident of rejection or departure is not read by the subconscious as a passing event. Rather, it explodes like a bomb, awakening the deepest fears and confirming the worst suspicions about the cruelty of the world. In these profound cases, excessive attachment to the other party and the identity collapse that follows their departure are merely symptoms of a much older disease. This attachment might be a desperate attempt by the inner child to compensate for an old emotional deprivation, or to prove worthiness of love after experiencing marginalization or neglect in their formative years. When this person leaves, you do not cry only for their loss. The primal wound of rejection is reopened, and all the feelings of helplessness and powerlessness that accompanied your childhood rush back to you. Stoic courage in facing the shadow. Dealing with this level of pain requires going far beyond mere philosophical repetition or superficial mindset shifts. Leaping over these deep wounds under the pretext of rational transcendence is a form of luxurious escapism. True wisdom lies in acknowledging the limits of self-practice and realizing that an identity damaged by childhood traumas requires specialized restoration. Here, resorting to depth psychology and dismantling attachment styles is not a contradiction of Stoic philosophy, but rather its supreme application. Stoicism teaches us to use the right tools to deal with reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. If the reality is the presence of a trauma rooted in the unconscious that makes a person's absence feel like the end of the world, then Stoic courage manifests in sitting in the therapist's chair, confronting those old ghosts and untangling the knots that have shackled your soul for years. Thus, we rebuild our identity on true, unshakable foundations. We do not merely refuse to reduce ourselves to a story of absence. We dive into our depths to heal the roots that made us susceptible to this reduction in the first place. We save our identity from immediate calling. Profound self-mastery, liberating identity from the grip of absence and the ghosts of childhood. When the dust of daily battles with memory settles, and after we succeed in taming our wandering minds through active immersion in life's paths, we reach the deepest and most fragile layer of the soul, identity. The greatest challenge following the loss of a pivotal person in our lives is not merely dealing with the emotional or temporal void, but protecting the fundamental building block by which we define ourselves. In moments of brokenness, the human mind, exhausted by the intensity of pain, tends to commit a fatal strategic error. It transforms a fleeting event into a permanent identity, making absence a black sun around which all the details of the self revolve. The cognitive sin, I am not the event, a person's descent into defining themselves as the one who was rejected or the victim who was left behind, is what Stoic philosophy calls the ultimate cognitive sin. Stoicism draws a strict dividing line between the action that befalls us and the essence that represents us. Rejection, departure, or the end of a relationship are all external events that revolve in the orbit of fate and the choices of others. They do not in any way touch your intrinsic value. When you allow this absence to seep into the core of your identity, you are practically committing moral suicide. You strip yourself of all your achievements, your thoughts, and your principles, reducing your vast, expansive being into a mere blind spot left by someone else. The true Stoic stands here as a vigilant guard at the gate of identity, vehemently rejecting this flawed reduction. They realize they are an independent human being, fully capable and dignified, who has gone through a painful experience of loss, but is absolutely not the embodiment of loss. This mental independence is the first shield that protects the psychological structure from total collapse. The hidden roots of pain, when awareness is not enough. However, despite the profound astuteness of the classical Stoic proposition that calls for changing thoughts to protect identity, it sometimes collides with a solid psychological wall, a wall revealing a deep gap ignored by superficial analyses of emotional resilience. Often we try hard to apply these rational rules. We repeat the principles and attempt to separate ourselves from the experience, only to find ourselves pulled by an overwhelming force toward the bottom of pathological attachment. Why? Because the problem, at its roots, is not merely a wrong thought that can be corrected with logic. Here we must open the locked door to the deep psychological dimension, past traumas and childhood wounds. For a soul whose makeup carries immense empathy and an extreme sensitivity to the pain of others, perhaps occasionally finding itself viewing life as an arena burdened with successive worries and sorrows, the incident of rejection or departure is not read by the subconscious as a passing event. Rather, it explodes like a bomb, awakening the deepest fears and confirming the worst suspicions about the cruelty of the world. In these profound cases, excessive attachment to the other party and the identity collapse that follows their departure are merely symptoms of a much older disease. This attachment might be a desperate attempt by the inner child to compensate for an old emotional deprivation or to prove worthiness of love after experiencing marginalization or neglect in their formative years. When this person leaves, you do not cry only for their loss. The primal wound of rejection is reopened, and all the feelings of helplessness and powerlessness that accompanied your childhood rush back to you. Stoic courage in facing the shadow. Dealing with this level of pain requires going far beyond mere philosophical repetition or superficial mindset shifts. Leaping over these deep wounds under the pretext of rational transcendence is a form of luxurious escapism. True wisdom lies in acknowledging the limits of self-practice and realizing that an identity damaged by childhood traumas requires specialized restoration. Here, resorting to depth psychology and dismantling attachment styles is not a contradiction of Stoic philosophy, but rather its supreme application. Stoicism teaches us to use the right tools to deal with reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. If the reality is the presence of a trauma rooted in the unconscious that makes a person's absence feel like the end of the world, then Stoic courage manifests in sitting in the therapist's chair, confronting those old ghosts, and untangling the knots that have shackled your soul for years. Thus, we rebuild our identity on true, unshakable foundations. We do not merely refuse to reduce ourselves to a story of absence. We dive into our depths to heal the roots that made us susceptible to this reduction in the first place. We save our identity from immediate collapse with Stoic logic, and we fortify it against future collapses with the courage to face old traumas, emerging from this battle as a complete entity, free from both the recent and the distant past. The conclusion of the grand narrative, the alchemy of scars, and the inevitable transformation of the hero. After diving into the deepest layers of identity and untangling the ancient knots that made absence a monster threatening our very being, we now reach the summit of the philosophical mountain. We stand at the final station of this arduous journey, to contemplate the view from the highest possible vantage point, where minute details melt into the comprehensive, panoramic vision of our existence. Here manifests the 10th and final rule, the true culmination of all recovery efforts, transforming them into a chapter, not the whole book. The cosmic vision, restoring lost proportion. At the peak of pain and the depth of attachment, a person suffers from what might be called emotional myopia. The lens of their vision shrinks until the absent person becomes the center of the universe, and the ended relationship becomes the only story they live for. Separation feels like the end of the world because the entire world has been reduced to a single face. Stoic philosophy steps in to treat this visual distortion by activating the principle of the view from above. This practice invites us to soar above ourselves, to see our lives as an extended reel, a grand narrative consisting of thousands of events, hundreds of characters, and countless stations of success and failure, meeting and parting. Within this vast cosmic context, the event regains its natural scale. The person who left is not the entire book, but merely a chapter within it. It may be a long, dramatic, or profoundly impactful chapter, but ultimately, it is just a part of a greater whole. Realizing this truth frees us from the illusion of eternal standstill. Life does not recognize truncated stories, and the hands of time do not stop at the page where someone departed. Once you give the experience its natural proportion, you discover that other chapters are waiting to be written, new characters will enter the novel, and events are yet to be lived. Thus, the Stoic protects their mind from collapse by dwarfing the individual tragedy against the backdrop of life's extended grandeur. Ink bleeding through the pages, the illusion of a clean fold. However, despite the magnificence of this proposition, it carries an oversimplification and an idealism that may not align with the complexity of the human psyche. The call to consider them a chapter that has ended might implicitly suggest that we are capable of turning the page cleanly, folding away the past as if it never existed, and moving on to the next chapter with a pristine, flawless blank page. Here lies the shortcoming. In reality, and in the depths of the human experience, pages are not turned so easily. The ink used to write harsh chapters often bleeds through the paper, leaving its mark on the pages that follow. Here emerges the truth we must never overlook: eternal scars and the inevitability of change. Attempting to convince oneself that the relationship was merely a passing chapter that left no trace is a form of denial that contradicts Stoic honesty toward reality. The naked truth is that some relationships break something that cannot be repaired to its original state, leaving scars on the soul that neither days nor the succession of seasons can erase. The person who enters a deep romantic relationship and emerges broken is not the same person who will enter the next chapter of their life. We have changed. Our view of trust has shifted, our method of evaluating others has adjusted, and perhaps we have become more cautious, more profound, or even more inclined toward wise solitude. This change is not a flaw in recovery, it is the tax of maturity. The alchemy of pain, amor fati, and embracing the scar. True Stoicism, in its highest manifestations, does not ask us to erase our scars. Rather, it invites us to what Nietzsche, an extension of Stoic thought, calls amor fati, a love of fate. To love everything that has happened, not because we are masochists who adore pain, but because this pain and these scars are the raw material that forge our current version. Accepting the scar is the pinnacle of courage. It is looking at the mark that person left on your soul and saying, yes, they passed through here. They left an indelible mark, and because of them, I am a different person today. This acknowledgement completely shatters the idea of being a victim. You are not a victim left with a deformity. You are a warrior proudly bearing the scars of your battles. It is exactly like the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold lacquer, not to hide the fracture, but to highlight it as part of the object's history, making it more valuable and beautiful than it was before it broke. Our emotional scars are that gold. The fear of attachment, the sudden sadness that visits us on winter nights, or the harsh maturity that forced us to see the world unvarnished, these are all manifestations of these scars. Accepting them means integrating them into our new identity, not attempting to obliterate them under the pretext that the chapter is over. Conclusion: the birth of the hero from the womb of tragedy. Thus the canvas is complete, and the threads of the long essay we wove together are intertwined. We began by recognizing the thought loop and observing the mind. We moved to severing the ropes of surveillance and separated reality from our illusions. We faced absence and forged our own closure, stripping pain of its false romance to bravely swallow true grief. We utilized distance as medicine without falling into the trap of loneliness, and reclaimed our time with wise productivity, interspersed with necessary negative rest. We tamed our wandering minds between presence and active immersion, and descended into the cellars of our souls to liberate our identity from the grip of the past and deep-seated childhood knots. And finally, we stand here, not to close the book, but to reread it with new eyes. The characters who departed were not mere passing mistakes. They were the chisels that sculpted our current awareness. They were harsh chapters, yes, but they are the chapters that push the hero, which is you, to confront their demons, discover their latent powers, and reach this level of profound Stoic peace. And finally, we stand here, not to close the book, but to reread it with new eyes. The characters who departed were not mere passing mistakes. They were the chisels that sculpted our current awareness. They were harsh chapters, yes, but they are the chapters that push the hero, which is you, to confront their demons, discover their latent powers, and reach this level of profound Stoic peace.
Move forward now to the coming chapters of your life, wearing your scars as medals, armed with your old grief as proof of your immense capacity to love, and your current resilience as a testament to your even greater capacity to overcome. The narrative has not ended. Rather, perhaps after all this maturation, it has only just begun.